Okay, now to do an intro. What should I do for the intro? A flying car, instigating the opening of the video, or perhaps a little image of the universe big banging into existence and then flash rapidly, blah 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 blah, whatever, rapidly flashing into uh, rapidly rapid passage of time. That's what I'm trying to say. Into existence. Uh, okay, yeah, I have to go. This is a live stream, so I'm going real low tech, low tech for the intro. Yeah, so okay, we'll big bang the universe into existence so fast, so rapidly, you don't even see space time, or you just see a flash of energy, and we've so rapidly appeared in contemporary planet Earth. Those many billions of years have passed, and here we are in yeah, that's what we'll do. That's what I'm going to call it. Just boom, there we go. Universe present. Universe is here. Yeah, all right. Really overdoing the intro despite how low tech it is. Well, I really need to shave. I'll get around to that later. Yep, really just kind of, yeah, there we go. Peekaboo, whatever. All right, all right, whatever. All right, yeah, there we go. Peekaboo, whatever. Time to get your freakiness card stamped, as it's almost Halloween. Let's get weird and freaky. And no, we're just. There's nothing special or freaky at the moment. Oh yeah, actually there is. What can I talk about? Well, so far I've talked about nothing, despite saying a whole bunch. Yeah, that's really special. So apparently they launched the list of PlayStation games that are going to be in the PlayStation Classic. That's kind of cool. It's kind of controversial for reasons that maybe I'll take a look at that list in a little bit here. Or maybe I'll just pull out my phone and see what crazy articles come up. I mean, the last time I did that, just randomly while doing a live stream, I found an article where they were blaming Russian bots on the bad performance of Star Wars movies. Oh my god. There's a lot of hilarious articles out there, and when I say hilarious, I mean unintentionally hilarious. That whatever. And then there's the could go back to the running gag of seeing because reality seeing creepy people around and leaving absurdly creepy comments reminded me of there's that creepy person. I need to be reminded of their existence. And yeah, if they're not glaring and staring in real life, they're just trying to be creepy on the internet. Which is probably going to have absolutely no effect on this video whatsoever. Just that was a running gag the last few times I did live streams because sometimes weirdness pops up. But anyway, yeah, the internet is haunted by creepy people. Prepare to deal with the. Ooh, the internet is haunted. Oh, yeah. The internet's haunted. Yeah, the internet is haunted. The internet is haunted. Yes. Despite the brain death, despite the brain deadness of some people, they're just filled with a I don't know whatever made Michael Myers so wacky. But Michael Myers is imaginary, and so is what. So is the force behind some people's desire to be intimidating or whatever the hell they try. I don't know. I'm just basically saying there's creepy people out there, and it's been a kind of like this almost like reoccurring thing that it actually hasn't been that frequent. So it's kind of hard to explain without explaining too much, and I actually didn't really want to do that. I just like going back to the idea. The internet is haunted! Detecting evil psychokinetic forces from the internet. Oh yeah, yeah, there, yeah, yeah, there it is. Yeah, oh shit. Yeah, 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 whatever. All right. Now, the thing that interested me the most is once again, as I switched on my phone, one of my phones, obviously not the one that's recording this live stream and sending it out at probably a horribly low resolution due to my connection speed. One of my cell phones right here activated it, and I've learned that the anti-tracker was doing another live stream, and this time it was comparing Star Trek phasers to Star Wars turbo lasers, because he's doing a kind of a series of what would happen, and my nose is itchy, what would happen if you were to put a Constitution class starship. At first it just sounded like he was doing a Star Trek versus Star Wars things, and he said, by showing what would happen if the ships battle. He's not saying one is better than the other. He happens to prefer Star Trek, but he also believes that any actual battle between spaceships would be extremely one-sided to the Star Trek ships. In the first video, he gives the example of the accuracy of Star Trek weapons and the range of Star Trek weapons, which is pretty fair. If you're too far away to be hit, and you could hit somebody else far more accurately at a farther range, you can just stay out of the other guy's range. And then then he did a video discussing slower than light, not warp drive and hyperspace travel, but actual combat in regular space between. The next video was that combat and not warp space, well, warp drive, not combat at warp, not combat at hyperspace, because in Star Wars, hyperspace combat is not possible. Also, not possible in Stargate's hyperspace either. But it is possible in hyperspace in Babylon 5. In fact, I do believe there was a scene in the Babylon 5 spin-off Crusade where you had ships fighting at in hyperspace, but hyperspace is more like a parallel dimension, more so in Babylon 5 than any other version. But yeah, that's kind of getting off topic. But basically, when the ships are fighting, that the Star Trek ships can move so much faster than the Star Wars ships even if you give an extreme margin of error in favor of the Star Wars ships based on what is calculable by watching the movies. And he's focusing on the movies, especially things related to the original series and any of the Star Wars movies. And I think his focus is on the original trilogy, Star Destroyer versus a Star Trek Constitution class starship is his focus. And this time today, I just noticed that I thought was interesting that he did one on turbo lasers versus phasers. Though he didn't talk a whole lot about the turbo lasers themselves or the phasers, just that the weapons and shielding technology seems to be comparable. And he mentioned, I've seen this online, like, because when you look at the dialogue both in Star Wars and Star Trek, ignoring the line, there's a line in Star Trek where they talk about lasers as being obsolete and not even able to penetrate a Federation starship's their navigational shields, not even able to penetrate those, let alone their defensive shields. Ignoring that line because Star Wars lasers aren't even regular lasers. Actually, the lasers portrayed in Star Trek aren't even regular lasers anyway. But ignoring that, you see the turbo lasers in one of the Star Wars movies destroy a big asteroid, which to me wasn't that big of a deal, relatively speaking, because it seemed like, Star Trek weapons could do that too. And he showed the difference of there's different perspective, the angles are shown, but it does seem fairly comparable in Star Trek The Motion Picture when a single photon torpedo blows up a big meteorite, comparable to the Imperial Star Destroyer blowing up similar meteorites with single blasts from the turbo lasers. And yeah, that's comparable. And to me, I never really found that all that convincing that Star Wars weapons were all that impressive compared to Star Trek weapons. Because the Star Wars weapons, when I say this one compared to uh, Star Trek weapons, obviously firing off a blast capable of vaporizing an asteroid like that is nothing that we could even do today. Because I think, based on the size of the meteorite, I think even a real world nuke probably wouldn't disintegrate it. It'd probably fragment it, and it wouldn't be destroyed as effectively as it was in that scene, I don't think. Even with a real world nuke. But then again, I could be wrong about that. I mean, obviously nukes are incredibly powerful, but maybe the Tsar Bomba. But yeah, well, but the thing is, if you were to compare real world weaponry to Star Trek weaponry, actually the Tsar Bomba would be the closest thing you could come to something comparable to what you see in Star Trek, and probably also Star Wars. And that was a big nuclear bomb made by the Soviets. It was a type of hydrogen bomb. And I think the actual amount of matter that gets converted to energy in one of those things would be, or I don't think it was the one they actually tested, because the one they tested was downscaled, because they were kind of worried about it was got to be so powerful. I mean, when you test something, you want to make sure you can get a safe distance around it. There's a whole bunch of factors in when you test a nuclear bomb that you risk excessive damage, and this thing they knew was going to be big. So when they tested one, it wasn't even the most powerful one they built. Anyway, I'll put it this way: the most powerful hydrogen bomb, which yes, that's more powerful than an atomic bomb. The H bomb outpowers the A bomb. Mainly because, well, with the A bomb, there's actually usually a chemical explosive that works as a trigger that slams two pieces of uranium together, surrounded by a material like that's a neutron reflector. I think usually, it's not usually graphite, but I think they could use graphite as the neutron reflector. But it's surrounded in the neutron reflector, and then but the uranium gets crammed down so close the chain reaction, bunch of matter gets turned into energy as the neutrons being radiated by the uranium. There's like too much of that in such a small space, and then boom! Crude way of describing it. I don't know how to describe it better than that. But yeah, you literally slam some uranium together, surrounded by a neutron reflector, and literally the radioactive decay of the uranium itself in that flash of a second is like there's so much scattered neutrons in such a tightly confined space that literally the matter starts tearing itself apart, and matter gets converted to energy. A lot of heat. If it's done in the atmosphere of a planet, amazing shockwave, which is actually why it's more realistic than you might think. When in science fiction, things like photon torpedoes and nuclear missiles are used almost like a bashing weapon. Like they hardly ever send one into the center of a fleet of starships and blow it up. Because while the particles that used to make up that nuke, or something comparable like a photon torpedo, well, the particles that previously made up that object and all the energy that it releases, it's got to go flying everywhere. It's dispersing, but it's not necessarily as destructive as if it was in the atmosphere of a planet and you have like that shock wave going throughout the atmosphere. So when you actually see like in a Star Trek ship fire a photon torpedo or similar weapon at another ship, and it's almost like a bashing weapon, like it seems to mostly affect whatever it directly hits. That actually does kind of make sense when you compare an explosion in the vacuum of space compared to in the atmosphere of a planet. It's still going to release an incredible amount of energy on the structure and or shields of whatever it is. In fact, realistically speaking, just about anything made out of normal matter should be very, very easily destroyed by a nuke, you know. But you know, if something's directly hit by one, even in the vacuum of space, but it is different than in an atmosphere. But anyway, Tsar Bomba was more than just an atomic explosion. As I mentioned, the chemical explosion that triggers like the atomic explosion. Well, in a hydrogen bomb, a normal atomic bomb is kind of like the start. Then that atomic bomb instigates the fission, the nuclear fission of the uranium. That kind of instigates nuclear fusion of heavy water, or, well, actually heavy hydrogen. You end up cramming hydrogen together, making helium, just like the sun does. I guess that might be why nuclear radiation can be measured in sunshine units. Isn't it so happy and pretty and fun that nuclear radiation can be measured in sunshine units? Isn't that what they called it? I think so. Sunshine units. Oh yes, what a bright and lovely thing. Like getting up in the morning, there rises the sun, or there falls a hydrogen bomb. Isn't that just humanity? Bringing the love of the sun to the earth in the form of a hydrogen bomb. And yes, I'm just mocking that. I should move on. But anyway, yeah, that basically converts hydrogen into helium, but you know, using heavy hydrogen, which is hydrogen that has a neutron. You know, most chemical elements, most elements have, you know, neutrons. Hydrogen doesn't need it because a proton by itself is pretty stable, like probably the most stable structure in the universe. Neutrons, you know, what, a half-life of 15 minutes or something like that, or is it less? I forget now, but you know, you bond a proton and a neutron neutrons become stable unless you have too many neutrons, and then it becomes unstable, and yeah, whatever. But basically, yeah, the insignificant trigger to the hydrogen bomb is an atomic bomb. Basically, the atomic bomb instigates nuclear fusion from the explosion of fission. But I guess people figured out it wasn't really a secret they really wanted to talk about. But there was actually more to it than that. You see, if it was that simple, the radiation shouldn't have been as toxic and nasty as what you get from a hydrogen bomb. Yeah. If you travel like half the distance from the Earth to the Sun, the radiation would become deadly. You know, which is probably a good thing the Earth is this far from the Sun. But you know, so yeah, I mean, a hydrogen bomb, even if it was just plain or mostly just fusion, fusion, even if it was mostly just fusion, it'd still be, you know, a nasty blast of radiation. But the radioactive decay left over, radioactive materials left over from the blast, kind of showed that, well, actually, the nuclear fission did instigate nuclear fusion, but that nuclear fusion instigates more nuclear fission, and then because, you know, all that energy, I guess, is coming back into the original fissionable material, and there's like multi-stage, yeah. Needless to say, a whole bunch of matter gets turned into energy, and you don't want to be nearby. You don't want to be nearby. And, well, I spent a lot of time getting to the point that you don't want to be close by if they set off a hydrogen bomb. And I believe now the thing is, if you do Star Trek versus Star Wars, the question is, would you use secondary canon or beta canon or non-canonical sources? Now, my thoughts are, with Star Wars, you should, but then you end up with two different universes. You end up with the old Star Wars Legends universe, which there are multiple Star Wars Legends universe if you think about it. The Star Wars Legends universe, or universes, is basically all the licensed materials that were written as if they were canonical, written to be taken serious as a story. Prior to the release of Episode 7. So Episode 7 did kind of kill Star Wars. And it wasn't worth it. Episode 7 was not a good movie and not worth throwing away what once was Star Wars. Now, some people would say, oh, the canon was already a mess. It's like, no, you had a pretty simple rule for the canon. Now, the most crude way of describing Star Wars canon was that you had your George Lucas level canon, sometimes referred to as G level canon, God level or George Lucas level. He created the Star Wars universe, and he used to have final say over Star Wars, you know. I suppose now you could say it's Mickey Mouse, but technically it's Kathleen Kennedy. But either way, it's not what it used to be. Oh yeah, the Starbucks. Starts with Star, like Star Trek and Star Wars and Stargate. And Star Furies, which are something that's in Babylon 5. But Babylon 5 isn't Star Babylon 5, so... to think of something that started with Star and connected to Babylon 5, I'll have to say Star Furies. Star Furies. Star Furies. Oh, yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, it's a coffee drink. It's double shot. What is it? White chocolate flavored. Oh, yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, I need my caffeine. I need my caffeine to function. Good night. Oh, no, wait. Anyway, yeah. So you had your secondary level of canon, which some people would say that it's referred to like the novels and the comics, you know, was the secondary level of canon. And it was. But some people would say, well, no, but there's so many comics and so many novels, they contradict each other. And it's like, not really. No. You see, the secondary level of canon, if you in its crudest form, then yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff that contradicts itself. But if you look into it, it's actually more than that. The secondary level of canon of what used to be the Star Wars universe was the comics and the novels, especially in the case of the comics, were the ones published by Dark Horse. The old ones published by Marvel that didn't really fit the continuity of the later stuff is mostly ignored. It's its own parallel universe, you know. I don't think the movies really took it all that serious, but for the most part, the licensed materials that started, especially in the 1990s, with some of the newer novels, that's when things got taken more serious. And the thing was, this was a secondary level of canon, and Star Wars used to consider it all canonical. But as a secondary layer of canon, it meant if anything that came from the first level of canon contradicted it, then it was wrong. It was wrong. Like, it was basically like you're being told a story from different storytellers. And at the top level were the movies made by George Lucas, and at that top level, anything that contradicted the first 6 episodes, those 6 movies made by George Lucas, if it contradicted that, then that detail was no longer true. The movie was true. The detail that contradicted it was not. And you had to reconcile that yourself, and the source material might retcon it in their own way later. Which was fair. I actually thought that was a pretty good way of going about things. You just read the books, read the comics, and think, if anything gets contradicted by the movies later, then you got to ignore it or reconcile it in favor of the movie and just move on. You know? And with something as large as Star Wars that had involvement with so many different people, writers, and so forth, you know, that wasn't a bad way to go about things, I felt. And they had all sorts of source books that basically followed those rules. They'd have a lot of details from the novels and the comics. And, of course, you know, if something was stated in a movie, the movie was fact, you know. And you have like the Star Wars like encyclopedia, the Star Wars what was it, the Star Wars Essentials guides. Yeah, I got a few of them in the other room, and I'm not going to go rooting them out right now. And with that, you could kind of explain what turbo lasers are above and beyond what was shown in the movies. Now, I mentioned the Anti-Trekkers video. He's not using any of that stuff. He's just using the movies themselves. And that also includes the newer movies, for better or worse. And I think everybody can agree that's for worse, because the new movies were bad. But that said, the one thing about the newer movies that actually was kind of consistent is the fact that turbo lasers have a limited range. Shields are shown. You can kind of see how the shields work and all that stuff. So for all intents and purposes, looking at Star Wars episodes 1 through 8, you can kind of figure out the limits and abilities of the Star Wars ships and shields. And so, yeah, fair enough. And I think it is fairly consistent with the old Legends universe. But there's new expanded universe stuff now, a new secondary layer of canon now. New comics and new novels that tell a whole new backstory to the Star Wars universe. Which I think was really unnecessary, the level at which they decided to just up and contradict themselves, or contradict the old Legends universe. And personally, I prefer the Legends universe, but by definition, the Legends are anything that's not part of the current canonical universe. So I suppose you could even say that the old Marvel comics are a Legends universe, just not the regular Legends universe that made up all those amazing Star Wars novels and comics that came before. With Star Trek, and I'm going to ignore Star Trek Discovery because to even get into how much Star Trek Discovery contradicts Star Trek, you can treat it as a parallel universe, but it's not just that the aliens look wrong. It's not just that everything is wrong. Well, it is that everything's wrong. So I'm going to ignore Star Trek Discovery. But looking at Star Trek, Star Trek had an entirely different rule. Now, if you look at the guides on the internet, there's a pretty good way of looking at it. You'll see like Alpha Canon, like Memory Alpha is the wiki page that discusses Star Trek as it appeared in the TV and movies. If it appears in a TV show or a movie, then it's Alpha Canon. The one exception is the TV show, the animated series, which basically was decanonized by Gene Roddenberry. And as much as I like some of those episodes, I do like the series, actually. As much as I like it, I do feel as though it does not fit between Star Trek, the original series, and Star Trek, the motion picture. And some episodes do. Some episodes would fit perfectly after the final episode of the original series and before the motion picture. Others do not, and it would take too long for me to get into that, and I already spent more time than I would have ever planned rambling on about Star Wars a moment ago. So, not going to get into Star Trek, the animated series right now. But you have your, Alpha Canon, which is, if it's in a TV episode or movie, that's your Alpha Canon. Then you have Beta Canon. Beta Canon can be anything that fits in between the Alpha Canon. And really, the Beta Canon is free to contradict itself. Every story could be considered its own parallel universe. But each one would be its own parallel variation of the Alpha Canon Star Trek universe. The Prime universe. Or actually, technically, you can have Beta Canon about the Kelvin timeline universe. You can have that as well, too. I don't know if you want it or not, but you can have it. But anyway, so the rule, basically, if something was portrayed in a novel or comic book related to Star Trek, and some of those novels and even comics were really great that came from Star Trek, it was going to be completely and utterly ignored by the TV series and generally also by the guides that were semi-canonical. There were some semi-canonical books, and those were basically like the technical manuals. And the TV shows were free to contradict those technical manuals. But the exception to that was, if it wasn't contradicted by the TV show, for the most part, those technical manuals were as good as canon. The writers of the novels were not going to contradict the technical manuals, or at least they shouldn't. Because the technical manuals, while the TV show creators were free to change their mind later, the technical manuals were actually based around the ideas that were brought about by the people making the TV show. But the people making the TV show, like if it didn't appear in an actual episode or movie, they were free to contradict themselves later on because the technical manual wasn't truly canonical. It was just the next best thing. So if Alpha Canon was level 1 canon and Beta Canon was level 2 canon, I'd say the technical manuals count as Canon 1.5. Maybe even canon level 1.4. And I could even see somebody thinking of it as 1.1 or 1.9, but for the most part, the technical manuals would be a pretty good interpretation of what you see on TV. Now, one exception, though, is some of the earlier technical manuals. For example, like the old Starfleet one based on Star Trek, the original series. How was Starfleet? I got it in the other room, and I can't even remember the title. Starfleet something or... I forget now. That was Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise. A lot of those details were up and changed. They were just up and changed. For example, originally, phaser. The phaser was originally supposed to be a photon maser. What does photon maser mean? It's actually technobabble in its truest sense. What's a maser? It's a real thing. A maser is a real thing. Think of it as like a laser, except... instead of generating light, visible wavelengths of electromagnetic activity, it's actually longer wavelengths of electromagnetic activity, microwaves. The maser generates microwaves. It's like a microwave laser, except instead of being a beam of red light or blue light or green light or a specific wavelength that's visible, the maser uses microwaves. And as for photon, what's a photon? If you're seeing this, then you're seeing photons. Photons are basically the particle or wave of electromagnetic activity that, it's like the light coming to you from the video screen. It's like the light coming to you from the sun. The heat waves coming to you from the sun. It could be microwaves and radio waves and infrared, or it could be all the way to visible light, which is actually a very small percentage of electromagnetic activity. And, you get shorter, more energetic wavelengths, and then you get your, like, ultraviolet, and then you get your X-rays and gamma rays. Photons are the particles of electromagnetic energy, basically light. And if you wanted to make a beam of light, or you want to generate photons, look at this. Any old flashlight or light source, look at this. Here comes a photon blast. Do you actually notice that? Yeah, there we go. Look at those photon blasts. I'm turning on the light switch. Yeah, there we go. Photon blast. Yeah, there you go. So, it's a redundant term. If you're generating microwaves, you're generating photons. If you've got a fucking flashlight, you got a photon blaster. It's like... So, the Next Generation Technical Manual, and hey, I get this right here. It's not the manual, that's in the other room. The phaser with the Next Generation got a better explanation. And This is actually this is probably my favorite phaser design. I like the overall shape of it, but I kind of like the trigger being a button that you press with your thumb. Although I really like the phase pistols from Star Trek Enterprise, just because I like Star Trek Enterprise. Plus when they deploy the phase cannons, they come down and then they come out, and the phase pistol actually even looks like a small version of the phase cannon, and it's just I just really liked it. I like the phase pistol. It almost looks like you can tell it generates like a particle beam here, and it almost looks like it's armor plated and shielded a little bit by its own compartments that open and close. It looks very physical, and it's got more of a traditional trigger to it. And I didn't get it out of the other room because it would have meant moving a bunch of stuff around. But actually, the original series prop phaser is a really impressive prop. I prefer the next generation phaser's overall look, but that prop, if you actually get a Type 2 phaser, you can see that the Type 1 phaser is built into it. The trigger is just a little button, on the place where a stereotypical trigger would be. But it's got like all the little dials it has on it. It's a very well thought out prop. The original series phaser. But when they came out with like a technical manual on how the next generation phasers work, which became the description of phasers in general, so dating back to the original series phaser, retroactively retconning what they are, because photon maser was never mentioned on screen at any time. The phaser became, some people call it a nadion beam. Not actually. Sort of, but not quite. There are nadion particles in the beam. Mostly involved with the creation of the beam if you read the original technical manuals. And the nadion particles do get mentioned canonically in the TV show. I think, I'm trying to remember if Deep Space Nine mentioned them, and I think they probably did. I know Voyager did for sure. I can't remember if Next Generation did or not, but I know they got mentioned a few times on Voyager. So what were the nadion particles? Basically, they were short-lived subatomic particles that could liberate the strong nuclear force. Which means if the beam was a pure nadion beam, that means every time you fired at something, those particles would passing through the air, and the objects they hit would immediately undergo nuclear fission. And if that were true, if that were accurate, and it's semi-accurate in the technical manuals. I believe it was the Next Generation technical manual that went into the most detail. I love the Haynes manual for the Starship Enterprise. I love that it included the NX-01 Enterprise, my favorite. I love that it kind of copies and repeats something from the Deep Space Nine technical manual that I really liked, which was the quantum torpedo information. I just love the description of the quantum torpedo. How it uses jacketed layers of synthetic neutronium and dilithium to create a condition similar to the Big Bang and create new particles in a way that even the photon torpedoes couldn't. And the quantum torpedo, I love reading the techno babble and the quantum torpedo description. But anyway, the original Next Generation manual for the phaser, I think, was one of the best. And if you go into the computer information in the Sega Genesis Star Trek: The Next Generation game, which also the Super Nintendo game too, they both have their own specialties. When I think of the phasers, I think of the Next Generation game more, but if I went back and looked again, maybe the Super Nintendo game would be a little bit better. But each one specializes on different things more. History of the Federation, you want the Super Nintendo game. I think most of the other technical stuff is a little more well fleshed out in the Next Generation technical, or the computer information in the Star Trek: The Next Generation game for the Sega Genesis. I hold a distinct preference for the Genesis version of the game, but I have them both, and they're both pretty damn cool. And I'd like to say that the Super Nintendo game did one hell of a good job of predicting Star Trek Enterprise. Just gotta say that. Anyway, because it gives the history of the Federation, which was not canonical. the origin of the Federation was speculated back as far as the technical manuals or some of the history books that were published related to Star Trek, back as far as when the original series technical manuals came out, like the Earth, Andor, Teller, Alpha Centauri, and Vulcan coming together and forming the United Federation of Planets. That there was like old technical manuals that made that prediction for quite some time, and the Super Nintendo game repeated that. It didn't actually become completely canonical until Star Trek Enterprise. I love that show. But anyway, the phaser. Anyway, there's reference to I forget how they pronounce it, but the special crystals that generate the Nadian particles. That force plasma through those crystals, and basically they liberate the strong nuclear force. References in the Next Generation technical manual to, and this is completely skipped in like the Haynes manual for the Starship Enterprise. This is complete, and a lot of the later manuals skip this part. But it builds up a protonic charge in the pre-fire chamber. The same thing goes for the hand phasers as well as the shipboard phasers. So the beam probably contains a certain amount of protons. It largely involves forcing plasma through crystals, and then the beam is radiated from the emitter, of course, and I think I've read some of the sources claim that it moved at the speed of light, which would contradict Star Trek, the original series. It tends to vary in speed depending on the settings and what's being targeted, or the settings on the hand phaser, things like that. Like, it's a variable of the actual... So I'd say that it's probably just the Nadian particles that move at the speed of light. And basically, I think both the Next Generation manual and the Sega Genesis game, probably also the Super Nintendo game, but the technical manual, the actual book, would be the closer to being anything canonical, actually describe the particles being generated, creating the beam, which... Like I said, if you can liberate nuclear energy in the particles inside of this, you're liberating a lot of energy. Like, if you have the battery power to instigate that, then you're instigating a lot more power than just what's in the battery, because you're basically instigating a nuclear reaction of sorts. It's kind of like, how powerful is the chemical explosive in a nuclear bomb? Not nearly as powerful as the nuclear blast, you know? So... if it's breaking apart nuclear bonds inside of this, it's generating a lot of power. And I know some of the descriptions of it I've read indicates that even at the higher, more dangerous settings, like the hand phaser could have a setting that could destroy buildings and chunks out of mountains and things like that. That in those settings, the more dangerous particles are, as the particles are radiated, the more dangerous parts of the beam are basically the result of particle reactions within the beam, which means not all particles in the beam would necessarily be traveling at the same speed. The particle decay and particle reactions within the beam make the more dangerous particles generate away from the user. So basically, you just release the force necessary to blow the side off of Mount Everest, which might be a bit more than the hand phaser would ever be shown to actually do, but let's just say you decide to take off the side of some mountain somewhere. Let's not necessarily use Mount Everest as the example. But let's just say you do that. You know, you blow the side off of a mountain with a hand phaser. That's a lot of destructive force. Well, a lot of that destructive forces would actually, according to that description, be forming away from the user in the beam. And, well, I mean... if particles are being generated by this thing, those particles have... I mean, you can't just create energy out of nowhere is one of the concepts in science. But if you generate something that's going to go nuclear later on, then, yeah, I mean... Pretty effective piece of technology, and the idea, and some people would say it's not the most realistic thing. That would mean that within just so many hundred years we can develop a ray gun that can destroy mountains. And it's like, well, yeah, but in Star Trek, not only do they have hundreds of years of development over us, They also have been studying and researching alien technology, and they're all coming together, mixing that science together, and then you have a phaser, which can be used as a weapon or a tool, Uh, so, to me, the phaser outclasses just about everything in science fiction. But again, that's just the technical manuals. That's not full-blown top level canon. Um, and they're probably similar to phase disruptors, and probably a little bit different than the spiral wave disruptor. There's also forced plasma phasers. I believe the Ferengi phasers are supposed to be forced plasma phasers. Federation phasers are generally just called phasers. The Klingons and Romulans use the disruptor, which I believe the Klingon disruptor has been established to be a phase disruptor, and I think the Romulan disruptor is the same. Cardassians, I believe, have both phasers and disruptors, and I believe the Cardassian disruptor is a spiral wave disruptor. And what does that mean? Yeah, whatever the writers want it to mean. But, alright, so this thing here. Actually, one of the things that kind of bugged me a little bit about this phaser design, as much as I like it, you see there's like a trigger button. Trigger button, yeah, it's cool. And then there's these two buttons here for the settings. One button is for beam power level, and then the other button is for beam width. Okay, does that mean when you hold down the button, you scroll through all the settings? It's not just a matter of pressing one button for up and the other button for down, or is there some way that you can kind of push up or to the side on the button to make it function differently? That I've never seen that established. Because if I want to go down a setting or two in a hurry, do I really want to have to scroll, watch the gauge thing and scroll through, all the settings? Because it sounds like in an emergency, quickly changing your settings on the phaser would be a chore. But if it's up or down, just that simple, that sounds fine. That seems logical, reasonable, But one button for all the settings, either for beam intensity or for width, because that's another cool feature of the hand phasers. It can actually have a wide setting, and you can spray a room with phaser energy. That just seems awkward. Now, the original series phaser has all kinds of dials and settings on it, which actually was kind of cool about it. And you got to think, well, simple is often better, but it's too simple. Too simple. I mean, if these panels here, popped up in a hurry, and it would almost be more convenient if they portrayed the panels up here for that you can open to access the interior. If popping those open could quickly change a setting, would almost seem more reasonable. But the overall design of this, I like that you press it with your thumb rather than pull a trigger. I kind of like that about it. I kind of like that the cover on it almost looks like a layer of armor plating. Like it's, I don't know, designed to take an impact or two. I like this phaser. I like this phaser. It's just that's the thing. I just didn't think they thought out the settings very well. But that said, it looks pretty cool. It's fairly iconic in a sense, the simple button layout, but it's at the same time almost too simple to rationalize when you actually read the description of how they get set. But so basically, every phaser shot, depending on the setting, is a potential nuclear explosion. Technically, by the description of them, the highest settings where you set the thing to the maximum level of disruption. But you never actually see that. In fact, one of the unique things about the Star Trek weaponry is they sometimes describe it as vaporization. And you also see this from disruptors as well, too, like the Klingon phase disruptor. You'll see people disintegrate. That's not very realistic. At least it's not realistic to call it disintegrating. Now, I was trying to figure out if I saw it anywhere else, if it was in the Next Generation technical manual. I know the Next Generation Sega Genesis game, I'm pretty sure is the place where I saw it described as that the phaser beam can cause continuum disruption or displacement. It was something along that line, and I should look it up again. What would that mean? It would kind of mean that they're almost pushing the person a little bit into subspace as they're being vaporized, which could explain why the blast doesn't just scatter across the room, that they kind of fade out. Because in one of the movies, they need a way to rationalize it if they're going to make a technical manual around this crap. One of the Klingons shoots another Klingon. What was it in Star Trek 3? And he's like he's in pain as he's burning away. But he's like half gone and still, like he's half there and half not there. Well, if he was disintegrated, there wouldn't be enough of him left to be feeling the pain. But if he was half phased into another state of existence, then that would explain it. So perhaps the Nadian particles in a phaser and similar in a phase disruptor kind of put things a little bit outside the realm of normal space-time, which would also explain why the blast doesn't, if you literally vaporized a person and you were in the same room as them, if they literally, just winked out of existence except they were actually vaporized, that means all the contents in their body, solids and liquids, would be turned into gas. You just created an explosion that... I'm not talking nuclear explosion, but that's still an explosion. Picture boiling something on the stove in a can or pot that cannot open, and then it blows open, You're getting close to that, except worse. And plus, what's being splattered around the room is materials that used to be, blood, guts, bowel contents, bones, and everything just... So that would be a nasty, vaporous explosion, You can't just have something instantly vaporized without consequences to everything around it, So that one reference to continuum displacement, you got to give that some credit, because otherwise you just can't account for some of the stuff the phaser is capable of. So maybe Nadian particles are halfway into subspace or something. They never really went in that much detail on them. And canonically, the only thing they've ever really established is that phasers can transfer energy. The incredible destructive power of the phasers can destroy the surface of a planet, especially if it's shipboard phasers. And there's been references to nadion particles and nadion particle discharges connected to phaser beams. Didn't mean the phaser beam was entirely nadion particles. Now, Klingon disruptors apparently work similar to phasers, and they were shown disintegrating somebody while he was still moving in pain, and screaming. There were lines in Star Trek, was it Star Trek Generations? I'm not sure. That the disruptors used by, I think, the Klingons, Romulans, and Breen. I think it was the Breen. But those three races, their disruptors, which I believe in technical manuals have been referred to as phase disruptors, leave a trace of anti-proton radiation, which I find fairly interesting. I mean, anti-protons are not going to last very long in a normal environment, because a normal environment's going to contain protons, and if an anti-proton can make contact with a proton, they will, and they will annihilate each other, and that tends to produce radioactive energy. But that's, it should probably give off like an energy signature that in the advanced world of Star Trek The Next Generation can be taken into account. or can be detected, whatever, with tricorders and so forth. Which I find interesting because if phase disruptors leave a trace of anti-proton energy, and phasers in the technical manuals, which is less canonical than the line on screen, but in the technical manuals, have referred to the phasers as building up a protonic charge in the pre-fire chamber, which may or may not get emitted. I'm trying to think if what I've read about the process to make it sound like. But if it's a pre-fire chamber, you got to think, well, it's going to do something with those protons. So, it could be that the disruptor might create antiparticles while the phaser might avoid creating antiparticles. That's just a thought. Because the disruptors are generally portrayed as most likely more powerful than phasers, or at least not having the low power settings that phasers have. Not being designed to accommodate low power settings, like stun settings, like phasers can, but having destructive power in the upper range on par, if not exceeding phasers. Well, if you pump enough energy into a phaser, it probably would hold its own against a disruptor. Probably would depend on the phaser or the disruptor, but I'm just talking about what would be portrayed in Star Trek weaponry. And like that's a pretty good description of what to expect from Star Trek weapons. And I do feel as though, like the technical manuals should be taken into account unless they contradict something on screen. That said, on screen there have been references to the incredible destructive power of phasers, even though they're rarely seen. Hand weapon phasers definitely have been shown to outperform what Star Wars weapons can do, especially considering there's a scene where Data fires at like an aqueduct or some sort of thing that had like almost like an artificial river of water running down something, and he targeted it, and there's like a shockwave of energy running up it and destroying stuff after he shot at it. Like the phasers are portrayed as being incredibly powerful, and they're also portrayed as being very versatile. And of course, it's Star Trek, and it's the United Federation of Planets within Star Trek and Starfleet in Star Trek. So the fact that it's a weapon, but it can also be used as a tool, seems very appropriate for a civilization that it's actually a decent civilization. That's kind of nice to see. Nice to see the thought of humanity becoming something respectable. Their weapons are basically tools. It's like, yeah, well, we're going to use these things to defend ourselves, but of course the science that gives us them, there's a diverse usage for them. And in Next Generation, you see power being transferred through phasers and phaser drills and all sorts of stuff. But anyway, yeah, getting back to what's canonical is incredible destructive power from the phasers. Settings that if somebody fired off one at the highest setting definitely would obliterate a room, possibly a good chunk of the landscape in the right environment. Phasers definitely seem to outperform anything Star Wars has. But Star Wars weaponry, and I'm not really sure what the new canonical information is, but I know in the old Legends books, phasers, or not phasers, handheld blasters, which I don't think they're ever really. I'm trying to think of examples of them being called lasers. Turbo lasers apparently work like blasters. Except they're bigger. Blasters are usually the handheld thing. There's disruptors, which are not really comparable to the Star Trek disruptor, other than the fact they were a handheld weapon that's more powerful than your average blaster. Basically, be it a turbo laser or a blaster, it's not actually a laser, but an energy similar to a laser energy, which you could call it a laser. I've seen it referred to as an exciter. Exciter? I'm not sure. But anyway, basically, well, kind of like a real laser can do. Lasers can turn materials into plasma. you can take special gases and excite them to become plasma with a laser. And that's what it does. Inside of a blaster or a turbo laser, plasma is excited by energy. So I'm going to say laser energy. Why not? Uh, Because if you're gonna use the word laser in reference to these things, damn it, a laser should be in there somewhere. And you know what? Compare it to phaser. Phaser, after they got rid of the whole photon maser thing, it became phaser, phased energy rectifier, or phased energy rectification, or whatever. It's kind of like a holdover acronym sort of thing. So I mean, if the phaser can be a reference to how the beam is created, as opposed to it's a proton blaster, which would indicate that something fires off protons, the phaser, the name, it doesn't fire off phase, it fires off, what's created by the process that creates the beam. With the Star Wars turbo laser, I think the laser is inside the weapon, and what's blasted off is perhaps charged up and activated because of the laser, but ultimately it's either a plasma bolt or a plasma bolt turned into a particle beam, which is actually kind of comparable to phasers, because the phaser uses crystals, forced plasma through crystals. Okay, are we reconnecting to the internet? Okay, I think we're connected to the internet. Well, who knows what's going on? Yep, back to the old gag. The internet is haunted. The internet is haunted. The internet is haunted. Yep, back to that gag. We were temporarily disconnected from the internet. Well, that could be because the internet is haunted. Oh, man, yeah. Look at that. It's haunted. It's haunted. Look, damn thing's haunted. All right, turn this off. Yeah, the internet's haunted. All right, anyway, I was really rambling on far too long. Anyway, all right, so we're reconnected to the internet. Yeah, so turbo lasers, in the old expanded universe description, the plasma that's created inside the turbo laser by an energy that excites it. I'm going to call it a laser energy because why else use the word laser in there? The plasma that's excited, forced through a crystal, becomes like a particle bolt. So it's kind of like a plasma bolt, but apparently it's particleized, so whatever, particle beam in the form of a bolt made out of plasma. So the plasma is converted into a particle bolt, whatever. So the turbo laser gives off a bolt of high energy plasma particles that don't necessarily move incredibly fast, but pretty fast. You wouldn't want to try and outrace one on foot, compared to a phaser beam, or for that matter, a gunshot, and it's not that incredibly fast, but dangerously fast and dangerously energetic. So there's that. So the fact that particles being converted through crystals, I could say that could kind of compare to phasers. Not nearly as destructive as a phaser in any description I've seen, especially in the movies. As much as they did a good job of vaporizing that asteroid, it's not that incredibly impressive. Now, when I think of something comparable to the turbo lasers and hand blasters, I actually think of the EM33 plasma bolt generator that they had in Star Trek Enterprise. And my nose is itchy. My sinuses are swelling shut. Not that bad, though. When I think of something comparable to the Star Wars blaster, I think of the EM33 plasma bolt weapon that they had in Star Trek Enterprise. And one theory is that the EM stands for electromagnetic, which would mean the plasma is, heated up with electromagnetic forces inside the weapon, and then plasma bolt is fired out of the thing. Then they couldn't use phasers because phasers wouldn't be invented yet, but they wanted something that would work similar to a phaser and sound a bit stereotypical Star Trek. So they came up with the phase pistol, which distinctly, if you pay attention to the on-screen description, does not actually sound like a phaser, but effectively you have stun and destructive settings, so it is very Star Trek in its usage, and in the word phase being part of the overall name. But it's not a phaser, it's a phase pistol or phase cannon, phase weapon, you know. With this, I assumed, based on whatever description you get of either the shipboard weapons, you know, when they deploy the phase cannons, or when they use a hand weapon, I personally get the impression that the energy in it stirs up plasma, and that plasma is converted into a particle beam, which makes it a more sophisticated weapon than the EM-33, that plasma bolt generator. More sophisticated, probably more adaptable. You know, you have stun settings and so forth, and you know, which I find that an interesting idea and an interesting way to just create a science fiction weapon. And they've been described as particle beams. They've been described as getting more powerful by the more plasma you feed in them. But then again, the plasma systems the electrical systems on the ship that power the high energy devices aren't really electrical exactly, but they're electroplasma systems. So that doesn't mean a whole lot, but you get the impression that my nose is still itchy. You get the impression that just dumping more plasma in to a phase cannon or a plasma cannon, either one, basically gives it more power that's being blasted out of it. And since the phase cannons are described as particle weapons, then it probably turns the plasma beam into a particle beam. And my thoughts on how it probably works is, after the phase modulation goes on inside of it that generates the beam, part of what it probably does, or maybe they even count this as modulation, which doesn't necessarily exactly match up with, well, I don't know if you'd say it lines up with the scientific description of phase modulation. When you see like a description of phase modulation, you'll see like two different waves, and I don't know how to describe phase modulation. But anyway, the particle beam, probably what I assume based on the fact they feed it plasma and it becomes a particle beam, is that I would assume that it, kind of like an alternating current of electricity, rapidly alternates the electron flow, like positive and negative are actually rapidly alternating in an alternating current. I would assume that the charge of the particle beam would rapidly alternate between positively charged and negatively charged at a speed that's so rapid that doesn't matter. But during that process, the particles being accelerated, kind of like how a cyclotron can, shoot off a positively charged particle or whatever, one direction, a negatively charged particle another direction, or is that, no, I don't know if that's a good description, but you can use magnetic fields to motivate and accelerate charged particles, either positive or negative, and control the direction of them. Well, I would assume that the beam in this is taking that plasma, which would overall be neutral, but positive particles accelerated, followed by negative particles, followed by positive particles, so fastly, rapidly alternating that doesn't really matter. At any second you're getting hit with as much positive or negative energy. It's just basically the ions are separated enough that it's a full-blown particle beam, but it's also plasma turned into a particle beam, and that's the impression I get by it being a particle beam weapon that you can just feed more plasma into, but it's at the same time not just a plasma weapon. And by the way, plasma can be accelerated with magnetic fields. I think it was Sputnik and other similar space satellites. There's a I think that's the one that uses it. There's a type of real-world space satellite thruster known as the pulsed plasma thruster. Did I say that right? Pulsed plasma thruster? I think it's pulsed plasma. But anyway, basically it takes like a little piece of Teflon and exposes it to an electric charge, which turns a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of Teflon, like a really tiny bit of Teflon, into plasma. and then it's magnetically the same charge, like when you run the electricity through it to turn Teflon into plasma. That same electrical charge can be used for the device that magnetically accelerates plasma, and to accelerate a tiny bit of plasma. And oh, you know what? I don't have this space to myself anymore, so I'm actually gonna end this with it just being all about me rambling on about Star Trek and Star Wars stuff, and I'll get back to PlayStation later. But yeah, the weapons are comparable. The Star Trek weapons, way more sophisticated and destructive. And I'm gonna end this, and why not? All right, there we go. Are you sure you want to stop streaming? Yeah, I do. And this space is going to be used for other purposes soon, so yeah. All right, let's end.